The archivist's life had been measured in whispers, dust, and silence. For 30 years he had wandered the echoing halls of forgotten libraries and shuttered churches, his presence so slight that most who passed him never even remembered his face. He was the man who polished glass cases no one looked into, who carried books no one asked for, who fixed lamps in rooms no one visited. His name, Elias, was seldom spoken with respect, often as little more than a passing afterthought. But on that damp afternoon, when a beam of light struck a crumbling wall in the old mission of San Jeronimo, everything changed. It was not supposed to matter. The wall was centuries old, cracked with age, covered with layers of plaster that had been painted over countless times. The priest guiding the archivist muttered dismissively, "Just another ruin. Nothing here but mildew." Elias should have nodded and moved along, but something tugged at his eye. A faint series of scratches carved deep beneath the faded paint, as though they had been waiting for someone patient enough to see. He brushed the dust with trembling fingers. The symbols were too deliberate to be cracks, curves intersected with rigid lines, forming a rhythm that stirred something in his memory. Not Latin, not Spanish, not Christian iconography at all. Elias whispered, almost afraid of his own voice. This isn't European." The priest laughed. "You see ghosts, my friend. The wall is nothing but decay." He waved Elias onward, yet Elias remained rooted to the spot, heart pounding. Something inside him insisted these markings mattered. He took out his notebook, an archivist's constant companion, and carefully began sketching the strange figures, while the priest looked on with mild annoyance. Later, in the evening, when Elias shared his sketches with his colleagues in the dusty archive hall, the ridicule came swiftly. "Carvings in a church wall? Likely graffiti from a bored child," scoffed Marquez, the senior historian. "You've read too many romantic tales," another chuckled, not even bothering to glance at the drawings. Their laughter echoed in Elias's ears as he stood silently, his face burning. He did not argue. He never did. His entire life had been an exercise in swallowing humiliation, enduring neglect, and hiding his thoughts. But inside, a fire smoldered. That night, Elias could not sleep. He lit a candle in his cramped room, unrolled the sketches, and studied them as though they were breathing entities. His mind wandered back to his youth, to the stories his grandfather had whispered in hushed tones, tales of lost tribes, secret codes, and civilizations buried not just by time, but by conquest. His grandfather had been dismissed as a dreamer, much like Elias was dismissed now. But there, by candlelight, Elias traced the lines again and again, his archivist's patience turning into obsession. The carvings were not random scratches. They were glyphs, ancient ones. He had seen something like them once, in a forbidden text, locked in the restricted vault of the university library. Mayan hieroglyphs. His pulse quickened. How could Mayan glyphs exist here, in a Spanish mission thousands of miles from the Mayan heartland? The thought seemed absurd, even heretical to accepted history. But Elias knew, he felt it. The wall was no accident. It was a message. He imagined the arrogant faces of his colleagues. If he ever dared to voice this aloud again, they would sneer, shake their heads, and remind him of his station. The quiet archivist, the janitor of knowledge, not a discoverer of it. Yet Elias could not let go. He whispered to himself, as if making a vow, "I will find out what you mean. I will not let them bury you in silence." The carvings were not just stone. They were the breath of a civilization calling across centuries, asking him, the invisible man, to listen. And for the first time in his long, quiet life, Elias felt a dangerous, exhilarating certainty. He was standing at the edge of a discovery that would not only silence the laughter, but also shake the foundations of history itself. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Professor Marquez's life. The candle flickered, throwing the symbols into shadow across the room. Elias leaned closer, heart racing, unaware that the journey had already begun, one that would lead him through ridicule, danger, and ultimately, the vindication no one had ever believed he deserved. By dawn, Elias's sketches lay spread across his desk. The candle stub burnt down to nothing but hardened wax. His eyes stung from fatigue, yet he could not pull himself away. Each line, each curve whispered to him. What had begun as idle curiosity now tightened around his chest with the weight of inevitability. When he returned to the mission of San Geronimo that morning, the priest barely looked at him. "You again? I thought you had finished cataloging." "I need another look," Elias replied softly, clutching his satchel. He stepped back into the shadowed chapel where the cracked wall stood. The morning light spilled through stained glass, illuminating once more the faint scratches. This time, he was prepared. From his bag, he drew thin parchment and pressed it carefully against the wall, rubbing charcoal until the shapes emerged more clearly. The patterns leapt out in startling detail, spirals nested in grids, dots punctuating bars. His breath caught. These were no child's marks. They were systematic. As he worked, voices from the past surfaced in his mind. Professors who had dismissed him as a file clerk with delusions. He remembered sitting in lecture halls, unnoticed, while classmates spoke over him. He had learned early that silence was safer than opinion. And yet, here he was, staring at glyphs that pulsed with a hidden rhythm. That evening, Elias retreated to the archive's lowest chamber, where he kept his private collection of forbidden texts, scraps he had salvaged from discarded boxes, fragments deemed irrelevant by his superiors. Among them lay a battered copy of Die Entschlüsselung der Maya Schrift, its pages yellowed and brittle. He opened it reverently. Comparing symbols, his pulse surged. Yes, the wall's carvings aligned unmistakably with Mayan numerals. He traced one symbol with a trembling finger, a bar with 3 dots, the number 8. Another, a cluster of spirals, known to represent Katun, a cycle of years. His mind raced. Why here? Why in a Spanish church thousands of miles from the Yucatan, unless the mission's foundations had been built over something older, much older? A noise behind him jolted him from his thoughts. Marquez, the senior historian, stood at the doorway, smirking. "Still chasing fantasies, Elias? What is it this time? Witches hidden in the walls? Demons scribbling graffiti?" Elias shut the book quickly. His throat tightened. He wanted to shout, "These are Mayan glyphs! This could change everything!" But he swallowed the words. Instead, he murmured, "Just cataloging debris, sir." Marquez chuckled and left. The sound of his footsteps faded, but the sting of humiliation remained. Elias clenched his fists until his knuckles ached. They will not laugh forever. He returned to the symbols, determined. One by one, he copied and cross-referenced them, until an eerie pattern emerged. It was not random text. It was a sequence, a code. Hours slipped into days. Elias began eating in haste, sleeping scarcely at all. Every free moment, he pored over his notes, convinced the glyphs concealed not just words but direction. A map, disguised as prayer. One night, staring at the parchment under lamplight, Elias whispered aloud, "You are pointing somewhere, aren't you?" His voice cracked, but the conviction settled deeper than ever. The code seemed to speak of a journey, a path through mountains, rivers, and a final resting place. And at its heart was a name, Uxul. Elias's heart pounded. He had seen that name once before, in a fragment scholars had dismissed as apocryphal. A lost Mayan city. He raced from colonial records. He leaned back, the weight of it pressing into him. He had stumbled onto something vast, something scholars with endless resources had failed to uncover. And yet he was still the quiet archivist, invisible, mocked, ignored. He closed his eyes and made a silent promise. "I will follow your trail, even if it consumes me. The truth deserves to be seen." Above him, the old church bell tolled midnight, echoing through the empty halls. For Elias, it sounded not like an ending, but a beginning. The days that followed consumed Elias in secrecy. By morning he shuffled about the archives, dusting shelves, repairing brittle manuscripts, answering curt requests from scholars who barely looked at him. But by night, when the halls emptied and silence wrapped around the old stone building, he returned to the glyphs like a moth to flame. He drew maps on parchment, aligning the coded symbols with ancient references he had memorized years ago. His hands trembled as he layered tracing papers over one another, discovering hidden shapes where none should have been. A pattern was emerging, like a constellation forming from scattered stars. And with every new line, Elias felt the weight of history pressing harder on his shoulders. Still, he told no one. The ridicule of Marquez lingered like a shadow. Even the thought of confiding in a junior assistant filled him with dread. They would laugh, dismiss, remind him of his station, the quiet archivist who mistook dreams for discoveries. At night, his solitude bred obsession. He stopped eating proper meals, surviving on bread and weak tea. His cheeks hollowed, his beard grew unkempt, but his eyes glowed with fire. He had tasted a mystery too rich to abandon. One evening, as a storm pounded against the old archive windows, Elias pulled an ancient codex from his private collection. It was a copy of Chilambalam, a Mayan prophetic text. Few dared read it. Fewer still believed it. But Elias's instincts told him the carvings in the church wall echoed its language. By candlelight, he matched a glyph from the wall, a spiraling motif, with a passage that spoke of the mouth of the earth where kings sleep. His breath caught. Was this a reference to a tomb? A buried city? The candle hissed in the draft. Elias leaned closer, whispering into the storm. They tried to hide you, but I will hear you. Memory surfaced his grandfather's weathered hands, guiding him over faded pages, saying, Elias, sometimes the truth is hidden because it terrifies those in power. But remember, silence is also a choice. At the time, Elias had dismissed it as an old man's poetry, but now it was prophecy. The carvings were more than history. They were resistance, a voice buried by conquerors, by priests who painted over walls, by historians who cared only for Europe's glory. And now the burden of listening fell to him, the man least equipped to carry it, or so they believed. In those hours, Elias lived in two worlds, the dim archive chamber and the dense jungles of centuries past. He could almost hear the Mayan scribes whispering as they etched their final messages into stone, praying someone, someday, would read them. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous it felt. If he was right, the carvings pointed not just to a forgotten city, but to records that contradicted accepted history. Colonizers had built churches over temples, erased languages, silenced voices. If his discovery proved true, it would force historians to confront uncomfortable truths they had long avoided. One night, his hand shook as he wrote in his notebook. The code is a map. It speaks of Uxul, the lost city. I am certain. But even as triumph swelled in him, doubt gnawed at the edges. He was one man, without wealth, without authority, with only sketches and scraps of evidence. What chance did he have against Marquez and the entire academic establishment? Still, he could not stop. Every time he closed his eyes, the glyphs burned brighter. He felt chosen, haunted, compelled. By dawn, his face pale, Elias whispered into the silence, If the world refuses to believe me, then I will go where the code leads, alone if I must. The vow was made, and though he did not yet know it, his secret obsession had set him on a collision course with ridicule, betrayal, and the discovery that would rewrite history. Rain hammered the clay tiles of Elias's tiny room as he hunched over the desk, pages of sketches and translations strewn in chaotic piles. His fingers were stained with ink, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Yet in that storm, he felt a clarity sharper than lightning. The glyphs were falling into place, slowly, agonizingly, but unmistakably. one symbol, repeated again and again, had taunted him for weeks. A spiral, framed by bars. He had traced it 100 times, desperate for its meaning. Tonight, the answer struck him like a blow. It was not simply a word, it was a direction. The spiral denoted a sacred well, a cenote. The bars, he realized, marked distance days of travel. Together, they described a route, a pilgrimage. Elias sat back, chest heaving. The sequence was not abstract poetry but instructions. Heart racing, he layered parchment over parchment, aligning the glyphs with known maps of Central America. His ink-stained hand trembled as he drew the line. The route began in the Yucatan, but curved westward, far beyond any known Mayan settlement. At its terminus, a cluster of glyphs described a place where the kings sleep in silence, where the serpent guards the door. Elias whispered the words aloud, his voice trembling. The lost city, Uxul. The sound of it filled the room like thunder. For years he had chased whispers of that name, dismissed by historians as apocryphal, a mythical city conjured by desperate scribes. But here it was, etched into the wall of a Spanish mission, calling to him through centuries of silence. He pressed his hands to his face, overwhelmed. The quiet archivist, mocked and ignored, had found the key to a secret empire. And yet, fear stalked his triumph. He imagined Marquez's smirk, the disdain of scholars who would shred his reputation before he could finish a sentence. Without proof, they would bury him alive in ridicule. Proof lay not in sketches or translations, but in the jungle itself. Still, the revelation electrified him. He rose from his chair and paced, muttering like a man possessed. They tried to erase you, but you endured, and I will follow your path. But his thoughts turned darker. What if I am wrong? What if exhaustion has warped my mind, and I chase illusions? He clenched his fists, fighting back despair. The memory of his grandfather's words steadied him. The truth is patient, Elias. It waits for the one who dares listen. At that moment, a knock at the door startled him. He scrambled to hide his parchments beneath a cloth. Marquez entered without invitation, his umbrella dripping rainwater onto the floor. Still awake at this hour? His eyes narrowed at the papers scattered about. Routine cataloging, Elias muttered, forcing calm. Marquez chuckled, his gaze sharp as a blade. Careful you don't lose yourself in fairy tales. You're here to preserve history, not invent it. Elias nodded silently, rage and humiliation boiling beneath his still exterior. Only after Marquez departed did Elias uncover his parchments again, staring at the spirals and bars that no one else would believe. For the first time, he allowed himself a smile. They could mock, they could scorn, but the truth was carved in stone, and it now lived in him. By dawn, as the rain eased, Elias had finished the translation. The message was clear. The carvings in the church wall were directions to a buried city where kings once ruled in shadows. The archivist had cracked the code, and though the world did not yet know it, history had just shifted under their feet. News of Elias's late-night vigils traveled faster than he imagined. Whispers filled the archive halls of the quiet man who no longer ate with colleagues, who scribbled madly on scraps of parchment, whose eyes glowed with some feverish purpose. His absence from routine duties only fueled the mockery. One afternoon, Marquez summoned him to the lecture hall. The room brimmed with scholars, students, and assistants. Elias, clutching his satchel of notes, entered to find himself already the subject of laughter. Marquez stood at the podium, his voice smooth and commanding. "Colleagues," he announced, "our humble archivist has been entertaining theories." His words dripped disdain. "He believes he has uncovered Mayan glyphs in a 16th century Spanish mission wall. I thought we might all benefit from hearing his revelations." The hall erupted in chuckles. Elias froze, throat tight, eyes scanning the sea of skeptical faces. He had not agreed to this. He had no slides, no diagrams, no authority. Only his worn notebook, filled with desperate ink scratches. Marquez gestured theatrically. "Come, Elias. Show us how centuries of scholarship have overlooked what you alone have discovered. The laughter stung, but Elias forced himself forward. His hands shook as he opened his notebook. Pages rustled like the wings of a trapped bird. This, he began quietly, pointing to a sketch, is not graffiti. It is a glyph representing a cenote, a sacred well. And here, bars denoting distance. Together they form, Marquez interrupted with a booming laugh. Distance? Wells? Next you'll tell us the church hides a map to El Dorado. The room howled with amusement. Elias's face burned. He wanted to vanish, yet something inside him snapped. For too long he had been silent, invisible, dismissed. He straightened his back, his voice steadying with resolve. It is a map, he said clearly, the words slicing through the laughter. The room fell abruptly quiet. A map to Uxul, a lost Mayan city. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the hall. A few students leaned forward, intrigued. But Marquez sneered, eyes glinting. Uxul is a myth, he said sharply. Fabrications from apocryphal texts. No serious scholar entertains it. Elias held his gaze, unflinching. My translations point to it. The carvings in San Geronimo align with the Chilambalam prophecies. You may laugh, but the truth does not vanish because it offends pride. The words shocked even Elias as they left his lips. He had never spoken so boldly. A silence settled over the hall. Marquez's smirk twisted into a scowl. Enough. This farce demeans us all. He slammed the notebook shut, nearly crushing Elias's fingers. You waste our time with fantasies. Leave the thinking to scholars. The humiliation was crushing, but beneath it smoldered defiance. As Elias gathered his scattered papers, he caught sight of a student's wide eyes, awed, not mocking. It gave him a sliver of hope. That night, in the solitude of his room, Elias replayed the scene. His heart ached with shame, but also with clarity. The public ridicule had stripped away the last of his hesitation. The scholars would never accept his words. The only proof they could not deny lay hidden in the jungle. He whispered to himself as he folded his notes carefully into a leather case. If they will not listen, I will show them. The wall has given me directions, and I will follow them, even if no one walks beside me. The archivist had been mocked, belittled, and silenced, but now he was resolved. He would no longer wait for permission to seek the truth. And somewhere deep in the jungles of the Yucatan, Uxul waited for him. The jungle greeted Elias with a heat that clung to the skin like a suffocating shroud. Cicadas screamed from the canopy as he trudged along the overgrown path, his boots sinking into mud with each labored step. Gone were the safe shadows of archives and stone chapels here. Every leaf seemed alive, every sound a reminder that the wilderness devoured the careless. He was not entirely alone. A small group had agreed to accompany him, 3 local guides hardened by the forest, and one young student, Mateo, whose eyes had shone with belief during that humiliating lecture. Mateo had sought him out afterward, whispering, I think you're right. Let me come. Elias had resisted at first, but the boy's determination mirrored the fire in his own chest. And so they walked side by side, the archivist and the apprentice, following glyphs no one else dared trust. By night, under oil lamps and stars, Elias pored over his notebook, aligning the carvings with their path. The guides listened quietly, never mocking, though one muttered prayers to ward off spirits. Mateo asked endless questions, his curiosity bright and unspoiled. Elias answered with patience, grateful for an eager ear after so many years of silence. Still, doubt stalked him in the shadows. What if Marquez was right? What if exhaustion and obsession had twisted his mind into seeing patterns where none existed? Each time the thought struck, he clenched his fists and whispered, Number. The truth is here. I've seen it. Days blurred into weeks. The path grew treacherous snakes coiled in roots. Rivers swelled with sudden rains. Thorns tore at clothes and skin. The guides threatened to turn back, warning of curses in these lands. But Elias pressed forward, his frail body driven by will stronger than fear. One evening, as the group camped near a limestone ridge, Matteo approached with something clutched in his hands. "Look," he whispered, unwrapping a shard of stone he had pried from the ridge. Etched into its surface was a spiral surrounded by dots and bars, the very glyph Elias had sketched from the church wall. His breath caught. Proof. They were on the right path. He turned the shard over in trembling fingers. In that moment, the ridicule of Marquez, the laughter of the scholars, the years of invisibility, all of it seemed to dissolve in the humid night air. For the first time, Elias felt certainty bloom like fire in his chest. But triumph quickly soured into tension. The next morning, one of the guides confronted him, voice sharp. "Senor, we cannot continue. This place is cursed. We will not lead you further." Elias's heart pounded. Without guides, the jungle was a labyrinth. He tried reasoning, offering double pay, but their eyes held fear deeper than coin could touch. One by one, they turned away, vanishing into the trees. Only Matteo remained, his jaw set, his eyes unwavering. "I'll stay," he said. "You believed when no one else did. I will believe with you." Elias nodded, overcome by the weight of loyalty. The quiet archivist, long abandoned, had finally found an ally. Together, the two pressed deeper, guided only by the fragile trail of symbols. Their supplies dwindled, their strength waned, but their resolve only grew. And then, on the seventh morning, they reached a ridge where the jungle fell away into silence. Below lay ruins, overgrown and hidden, yet unmistakable stone walls etched with glyphs, toppled temples strangled by roots, an ancient city sleeping beneath the canopy. Elias fell to his knees, tears burning his eyes. He had followed the code, and it had led him here. Uxul. The archivist's dangerous journey had borne fruit, but he could not know yet that the discovery would ignite a storm fiercer than any jungle rain, one that would test not only his courage, but the arrogance of those who had mocked him. The first steps into the ruins were like crossing a threshold between worlds. The jungle, loud with the chorus of insects and birds, seemed to hush as Elias and Matteo pushed aside vines and entered the shadow of a toppled stone archway. Moss clung to the carvings. Roots split the once proud steps, yet beneath the weight of centuries the city still breathed. Elias's chest tightened. Here it was, the place scholars had dismissed as myth. His trembling hand brushed against a glyph etched into a stone slab, the spiral and bar motif repeating like a signature across walls and pillars. The code had not lied. Matteo's eyes widened in awe. It's all real," he whispered. Elias could not speak. He felt as though the earth itself had risen to vindicate him. The years of humiliation, the endless silence, the sneers of Marquez, all of it fell away in the face of stone that defied erasure. They pressed deeper. A grand stairway, half buried in earth, led to a plaza overrun by strangler figs. Broken stelae littered the ground, each carved with kings whose faces had been chiseled away, deliberate erasures. The silence was heavy, as if the rulers themselves demanded respect. Inside a collapsed temple, Matteo's lamp revealed murals, faded but still vibrant in places. Figures danced, priests raised offerings, serpents wound through skies painted in ochre and black. But what seized Elias's breath were the inscriptions that framed the mural. He traced them reverently, his lips moving in silent translation. "It speaks of exile," he murmured, "a dynasty that fled conquest, hiding where no one would follow, and a vault where their treasures and records were sealed." His voice shook. "They buried their truth here." Matteo leaned closer. "Then we have to find it." Elias nodded, though fear crawled at the edges of his joy. Such a vault, if it existed, would upend centuries of history, and those who profited from the accepted story would not welcome this truth. That night they camped among the ruins, firelight dancing against broken walls. Elias could not sleep. His thoughts churned with equal parts triumph and dread. In his notebook he wrote, "The kings sleep here, their silence is not death. It is testimony. Tomorrow, we search the temple depths, but the jungle did not grant them peace. Before dawn, shadows moved at the edge of camp. The crack of a branch snapped Elias awake. Figures emerged, men with rifles, faces stern beneath wide-brimmed hats. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, heart pounding. The leader smirked. "We might ask the same, but we already know." He pointed to Elias's notebook. "You've come chasing fantasies, and yet here they are, carved in stone." Elias's stomach turned. How had they been followed? Then he realized, with cold clarity, Marquez, the man who mocked him, had sent others to seize whatever Elias might uncover. The armed men rifled through his belongings, snatching his sketches. The leader sneered. "You've done the hard work for us. The scholars in the capital will be very pleased." Elias lunged, desperation overtaking fear. "No, you don't understand. This city belongs to history, not your greed." A rifle butt struck his chest, throwing him to the ground. Pain exploded through his ribs. Mateo cried out, struggling, but was shoved aside. The men laughed as they departed into the jungle, carrying Elias's notes. Left in the dirt, gasping, Elias clutched at the soil as though it could anchor him. He had found the truth, touched it, breathed it, only to have it torn from his hands. Tears blurred his vision, yet even through the haze of pain and despair, one truth glimmered stubbornly. The ruins remained. The vault still waited, untouched. They had not taken that, he whispered hoarsely. They can steal my words, but they cannot silence the stones. The archivist rose slowly, painfully, his resolve unbroken. Tomorrow, he would descend deeper into the city's heart. The real discovery was still ahead. Weeks later, the ruins of Uxul lay heavy in Elias's memory, as though the stones themselves followed him back to the world of men. The scars on his ribs still ached from the rifle strike, but they were nothing compared to the deeper wound, the theft of his notes, the mockery he knew awaited him once more in the academic halls. When he finally returned to the city, news had already spread. Marquez stood in the lecture hall, preening like a peacock, unveiling Elias's very sketches. The professor's voice rang out proudly. "Here lies proof of Uxul, the mythical city once thought lost. Through my team's dedicated work, we have confirmed its existence." Applause thundered, filling the chamber. Elias stood in the shadows at the back, invisible as always. His throat burned with fury. Mateo beside him whispered, "They've stolen everything." But Elias only shook his head. Not everything. Because deep inside Uxul, beyond the plaza and murals, Elias and Mateo had found what the intruders had overlooked. A sealed chamber beneath the temple floor, its entrance hidden behind collapsed stone. Inside lay stelae, untouched by chisels, inscriptions unbroken, and offerings of jade and gold that gleamed like frozen fire. But more precious than treasures were the scrolls bundled, wrapped in bark cloth, preserved in the dry cavern air. The voice of the kings themselves, intact. Elias had hidden them where no thief would dare look, in a niche only he and Mateo knew. He had carried fragments back with him, wrapped in cloth and tucked beneath his shirt during the long return journey. Proof undeniable, waiting to speak. Now, as Marquez soaked in applause, Elias stepped forward. His quiet voice cut through the noise. "You stand on stolen words." The hall fell silent. Marquez's smirk faltered. Elias moved to the front, laying a scroll upon the podium. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The parchment bore glyphs no scholar had ever seen. Clear, unbroken, radiant with history. "This," Elias said, his voice steadier than ever, "is Uxul. Not your fantasy, not your trophy, but the testimony of a people erased. You laughed when I warned you. You mocked when I showed you. But stone does not lie. The kings sleep no longer." The room trembled with whispers, scholars surging forward, eyes wide with awe. Marquez, pale, stammered, "Impossible. How?" Elias looked at him with quiet fire. "The truth does not bow to arrogance. You may steal my notes, but not my discovery." Uxul belongs to history, not to you. Weeks later, international headlines blazed with the revelation. Lost Mayan city unearthed by Archivist. Museums clamored for access, scholars revised their narratives, and the world bowed to the quiet man they had once dismissed. Elias, however, did not seek fame. He returned to the mission chapel, laying a hand on the wall where it had begun. The faint carvings stared back at him, silent yet eternal. He whispered, "I kept my promise. They will hear you now." Mateo stood beside him, pride shining in his young eyes. "You've changed history." Elias smiled faintly. I only listened. The stones changed history. I was merely patient enough to hear them." And with that, the quiet archivist walked away, not as the invisible man of dust and whispers, but as the keeper of voices once buried. He carried no crown, no applause, but something greater, the knowledge that he had given justice to the forgotten. The moral was clear. Arrogance may claim credit, but truth belongs to those who endure. Greatness often hides in silence, waiting for the overlooked to uncover it. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.